If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The tavern stood against the outer wall of the Roman frontier town, its plastered walls stained with smoke and age. Outside, the sounds of carts, mules, and shouting merchants echoed through the narrow street. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of roasted meat, spilled wine, and sweat. Oil lamps swung lightly from iron hooks, and the fire at the central hearth sent uneven light across wooden tables worn down by years of dice games and soldiers' fists. The owner of the tavern, a heavy man with a loud voice, oversaw his business with the confidence of someone who understood both greed and survival. His tavern was more than a place for food and drink. It was where legionaries spent their wages, where merchants bartered for information, and where anyone on the edge of Rome's power came to dull the weight of their lives. He had little interest in people, only in what they could bring him: coin, labor, or silence. That evening, a merchant entered carrying with him not just goods, but a young woman. She walked behind him, her wrists raw from rope, though the rope had already been removed. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes plain and dust-stained, the kind given to captives. She kept her eyes down, moving as if she wanted no one to notice she existed. When the tavern owner asked the price, it was discussed without hesitation. Silver exchanged hands in the same way one would pay for a barrel of wine. The merchant left without a glance back. The woman stood in the corner, uncertain of her place. She was no stranger to fear. She had lived with it since the day her village had been taken, when screams had filled the air and she was separated from her family. Each new hand that claimed her had reminded her of how powerless she had become. Now, as she stood in the tavern filled with strangers, she felt her chest tighten. The laughter of drunken men and the clatter of dice made her feel exposed, yet she forced her face to remain blank. She had learned quickly that showing fear invited cruelty. Her thoughts were fixed on survival. Stay quiet, obey, and do not draw attention. If they forget you are here, you live another day. It was the same rule she had repeated to herself since captivity began. At the farthest table, a man watched without calling out. He was not young, and the years had marked him with scars that spoke of battlefields far from his place. His armor rested on the bench beside him, his red cloak folded neatly instead of thrown aside. He sat straight, even though no officer was present, because discipline had been carved into him long ago. His name was Marcus Aelius Varro, a veteran of campaigns in Dacia and Germania. He had been stationed here, not for glory, but because his service had left him too scarred for frontline battles, yet too valuable to be cast aside. His function was simple: keep order in the frontier, train recruits, and remind the young soldiers what discipline looked like. Marcus's eyes followed the girl as she was ordered to serve wine. He did not stare in hunger or curiosity, as many of the younger soldiers did. He saw instead the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her hands shook faintly when she lifted a jug, the way she avoided even the smallest glance toward the men she served. He recognized that look. It was the same look he had seen in the faces of prisoners taken after battles. Men and women who had lost everything in a single night and had learned that silence was the only defense left to them. As she moved between tables, she caught sight of him watching. Her stomach clenched. For an instant, she feared he would call her, demand something, test her like the others did. But he didn't. He simply inclined his head, a small acknowledgement, and returned to his cup. That simple gesture unsettled her more than cruelty would have. She had prepared herself for mockery and orders, but not for quiet respect. Marcus returned his gaze to the table, but his thoughts lingered. He was a soldier of Rome, hardened by years of violence, yet he could not ignore what he had just seen. The girl was not broken. She was holding herself together with silence, the same way he had learned to endure after burying comrades in foreign soil. He lifted his cup again, not out of thirst, but to keep from staring longer than he should. The tavern continued its noise. Dice clattered, coins exchanged hands, drunken voices rose. Yet at that far table and in that quiet corner, two people carried their silence differently than the rest. One to hide, the other to endure. For the tavern owner, she was only labor. For the soldiers, she was a distraction. For Marcus, though he would not admit it to himself yet, she had already become a mirror of his own scars. The girl's first night in the tavern was long, filled with orders barked at her and the weight of too many eyes following her every step. When dawn came, she was given no chance to rest. The tavern owner sent her straight into work, sweeping, fetching water, carrying heavy jars of wine from the storage room. She did it without protest, her mind focused only on not making mistakes. Each time she stumbled or spilled a drop, she braced for punishment. But the owner, though greedy and sharp-tongued, cared more about efficiency than cruelty. As long as she worked, he allowed her silence. That was a relief she had not expected. What remained unclear, and what weighed on her, was how long she would stay here. Captives sold into labor were often moved again when another buyer paid a better price. She thought often of this, wondering if tomorrow would bring another hand pulling her away. She tried not to think of her family. She did not know if they lived, and the thought of them, faces she might never see again, was something she forced herself to bury. The soldiers who filled the tavern each evening made her task harder. Some tried to speak to her, asking her name, her origin, but she kept her eyes lowered and moved on quickly. A few grew frustrated, yet the tavern owner warned them not to break what he had paid for. Still, she lived in constant fear that one night, someone stronger or drunker would ignore such warnings. That fear showed in the way she kept her back always close to a wall, never standing in the open unless ordered. Marcus noticed this carefully. He had watched her now for several days, and the pattern was clear. She was not mute. Her silence was chosen. She feared words could lead to something worse. He thought of asking her directly, but something in her rigid posture stopped him. He knew that pressure would only drive her further into herself. He had seen recruits after their first battles retreat into silence, building walls inside their minds to keep from breaking. He recognized that she lived behind such a wall. Marcus himself was not free from questions. He wondered why fate had placed her in this tavern, in his path. He had not sought companionship. His life was simple: train the younger soldiers, keep order when fights broke out, and drink alone when the day ended. He had no family in this town, and Rome had long forgotten men like him except when war demanded their lives. He had accepted loneliness as the price of survival. Yet now, each evening, when she set down his cup, he found himself searching for the smallest sign in her face, whether she had eaten, whether she was too tired to stand, whether she had found a moment of rest. He never let these thoughts reach his expression, but they weighed on him nonetheless. The girl, though still afraid, began to notice something strange. He was the only man who did not speak to her with demands. When she set down his bread, he gave a simple nod. When she poured his wine, he did not grab her wrist or force her to linger. He looked at her only with a quiet steadiness that carried no threat. At first she thought it was indifference, but she began to sense it was something else. It was restraint, the kind she had never seen before in a soldier. The other men in the tavern laughed, gambled, and drank with little care for what lay beyond the walls of the town. Yet Marcus carried himself differently. His scars, his calm posture, and his silence set him apart. The girl began to wonder who he was, why he stayed here, and why a man who looked like he had lived through so much chose to sit alone when he could have demanded the company of anyone. The questions the tavern left unanswered, her true origin, his unspoken past, and whether their silence could ever become more than mere endurance, hung in the air between them. And though no words had yet passed, both had already begun to sense that the small exchanges they shared, brief and restrained, mattered more than either of them wished to admit. The third week after her arrival brought colder nights. The tavern's hearth burned longer, filling the air with smoke that clung to skin and clothing. The girl had grown accustomed to the rhythm of work. Wake before dawn, carry water, serve wine, sweep ash. Each task was predictable, and predictability meant safety. Yet the unease inside her never faded. She lived every day prepared for someone to strike her, to drag her outside, or to send her away to another owner. The fact that it had not yet happened made her suspicious, as if punishment waited just beyond the next mistake. The tavern owner had given her a place to sleep, a small corner near the kitchen where sacks of grain and clay jars pressed against the walls. It was not comfort, but it was shelter, and to her that mattered. What she did not understand was why he had bought her. She overheard soldiers asking the same thing. Was she meant to be a servant or something else? The tavern owner brushed them off. He had no use for trouble among his paying men, and her silent obedience made her useful. She realized then that her survival here depended not only on her own restraint, but also on the tavern owner's greed. As long as she made his business run smoother, she had a place. This calculation became part of her daily thinking. Marcus, seated often at the same table by the wall, noticed these small adjustments. He had questions of his own. Where had she come from before she was dragged into this place? Was her family left searching for her? He could see the outline of suffering in her eyes, but no detail, and part of him wondered if knowing would help or only wound them both further. He remembered prisoners taken after Rome's campaigns in Dacia, men sold to mines, women sent to farms or houses of the wealthy. He knew the pattern too well, and he began to suspect she was one of them. That knowledge carried weight. He understood that what she had lost was not just freedom, but the certainty of her name, her identity, and her place in the world. One evening, when the tavern grew quieter and the dice players had left, she carried a jug of watered wine to his table. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the weight, but from the awareness that she was alone near him. She waited for the nod that always followed, but instead he spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, low, as if careful not to startle her. "Have you eaten today?" She froze. The question was so ordinary, yet it cut into the wall of silence she had built around herself. She hesitated, then whispered, "Yes." It was barely audible, but it was the first word she had offered anyone in this tavern. Marcus did not press further. He only gave a small nod and returned to his cup. She left quickly, her heart pounding. All night, she thought about why he had asked such a question. Was it pity? Was it suspicion? She did not know, but the memory of his tone, measured without command, stayed with her. The next days passed in the same rhythm, but she found herself less afraid when approaching his table. She began to notice the scars on his arms, the way he rubbed one shoulder as if it carried pain too old to heal, the way he never joined the other soldiers in their gambling or boasting. She wondered about his life, just as he wondered about hers. The questions left unspoken in the first days, the nature of her past, the reason for his solitude, whether either of them had a future beyond silence, were slowly forming into something they could no longer ignore. For the first time since her capture, she began to feel that someone saw her not as property or labor, but as a person. And though it frightened her to admit it even to herself, that thought gave her strength she had thought lost forever. The nights grew colder as winter crept along the frontier, and the tavern filled even more quickly, soldiers eager for warmth and strong drink after patrols along the wall. The girl worked with the same quiet rhythm, yet she had changed in ways subtle but clear. Where once her hands had trembled at every command, she now moved with steadier control. Her silence remained, but it was less from fear and more from choice. She had learned the patterns of the men who visited, which ones spoke with harmless drunkenness and which ones carried danger in their eyes. She positioned herself carefully, always aware of distance and escape. These were small decisions she made each day, strategies of survival that most of the tavern's patrons never noticed. But Marcus noticed. He watched the adjustments in her movements, the way she no longer pressed herself entirely against the walls, but allowed herself to step into the open when she judged it safe. He noticed how she lingered slightly longer at his table, just enough for their eyes to meet before she walked away. For him, this was not entertainment or curiosity, it was recognition. He had spent years studying men on battlefields, reading fear, pride, and weakness in the faces of both comrades and enemies. Now he studied her in the same way, not to exploit her, but to understand the silent language of endurance she carried. The other soldiers began to talk. Whispers spread through the room about who she was and where she came from. Some claimed she was nothing more than a slave taken in a raid, while others swore they had heard her family name before, one tied to a household once respected in a nearby province, now ruined after Rome's conquest. The girl heard fragments of these rumors as she passed between tables, each one reopening questions she had forced herself to bury. She never confirmed nor denied any of it, because to speak of her past felt like tearing open wounds she had barely kept closed. Yet the whispers reached Marcus's ears as well, and he weighed them silently. The audience, anyone sitting in that tavern long enough, would have wondered the same things. Was she truly a woman of status before her capture? Did she still carry loyalty to family or tribe beyond these walls? What would become of her if someone powerful recognized her? And for Marcus, why had a seasoned veteran like him remained in this town, lingering in a place of noise instead of returning to Rome or seeking land of his own? These unanswered questions hung in the air like smoke from the hearth, impossible to avoid. Marcus began to answer them in his own mind. He stayed here not because of duty to Rome, but because there was nowhere else to go. Years of service had stripped him of a family life, and the land promised to him as a reward had been given to others. He had no wife, no children, and no inheritance. This tavern on the edge of the empire was less a posting and more a final station, a place where forgotten soldiers faded into the background. That was why he sat alone. That was why his silence had been his companion long before she arrived. One evening, after the crowd thinned and only a few men remained, Marcus saw her sitting by the hearth, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The firelight caught her face, showing not just weariness but conflict, her jaw set as if she were holding back words. He approached slowly, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. When he sat down across from her, she tensed, ready to flee. But he placed his hand on the table, palm open, scarred fingers still. He did not touch her. He only left it there, a sign that he was near but not demanding. She looked at his hand, then at him. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly meet his eyes. There was no command there, no hunger, no mockery, only patience. Something inside her tightened and then gave way, a pressure she had carried since her capture. She exhaled slowly, her chest shaking, and though she said nothing, the silence between them was different now. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of recognition. From that night forward, their bond began to shift. She did not speak openly, and he did not ask questions, yet both understood something had been decided. They were no longer two strangers sharing the same room. They had begun to acknowledge each other as more than survivor and observer. The questions of her true past and his reasons for staying were not answered aloud, but for now they did not need to be. What mattered was that for the first time since either of them had been left behind by the world, they were not alone at the table. The fire in the tavern's hearth crackled low that evening, and the air inside felt heavier than usual. The whispers had grown too loud to ignore. A trader from the south, drunk but sharp-eyed, swore he had seen the girl before. He claimed she was the daughter of a provincial noble family that had stood against Rome during the last rebellion. Others leaned in to hear, their voices hushed but eager, repeating half-truths and guesses. To them, it was a game of rumors, but to her, every word cut deep. She kept her head lowered, her hands steady on the cups she carried, but inside her stomach knotted with dread. She had worked so hard to erase her past, to survive by becoming invisible. Now the past was beginning to claw its way back. Marcus sat in his usual place, listening. He heard the laughter and muttered words, the careless way men treated the pain of others as tavern amusement. His jaw tightened. He had suspected there was more to her than silence and obedience, but hearing her name tied to a ruined family brought the truth closer than he expected. He did not confront her, not there, not under so many eyes. But the question pressed on him, what did it mean for her if these whispers reached the wrong ears? A woman of a fallen noble house, living as a slave in a tavern, could be used as a tool, a warning, or worse. Rome was merciless in how it displayed the conquered. Later that night, after the room emptied, he found her near the kitchen where she often sat once the work was done. Her hands were trembling even though she tried to hide it in her lap. She did not look up when he approached, but she felt his presence. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, his voice broke the silence. "Is it true?" His tone carried no accusation, only steadiness. Her throat tightened. She wanted to lie, to dismiss the question, but the weight of it was too heavy. Slowly, she nodded. Her voice was quiet, strained. "Yes, my father," he resisted Rome. "We lost everything." She stopped, pressing her lips together as if each word tore something from her. Then she added, "I'm the last of them." Marcus absorbed this without change in his expression. Inside, though, he felt a shift. He had fought in campaigns where men like her father had been branded enemies of the empire, and he had carried out orders that had left families like hers broken. He could have looked at her as Rome's spoils, as justice served, as the empire intended. But he didn't. He saw a woman who had been stripped of name and dignity, yet still held herself together in silence. He knew what it meant to lose everything, even if his losses came from years of war rather than conquest. She searched his face, expecting disgust, rejection, or coldness. Instead, he asked one question: "Do you wish to leave?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Freedom was dangerous. Leaving could mean being hunted, enslaved again, or killed. Staying meant chains of another kind: service in a tavern, survival under another man's authority. Her eyes filled with a fear that was mixed with something else: hesitation, maybe even hope. She shook her head, firmly though her hands still trembled. "No, here, I can work. Here, I can stay alive." Her voice cracked slightly, but there was resolve in it. Marcus nodded once. He did not press her further. In that moment, he understood her choice. Freedom meant nothing without safety. What she needed was not escape, but a place where she was not alone, where she could choose to stay. For the audience, anyone watching them, the unanswered questions from the beginning had now been brought forward and answered naturally. Who was she before the tavern? A daughter of a family destroyed by Rome. Why had she remained silent? Because silence was the only shield she had left. Why had Marcus stayed on the frontier? Because Rome had left no place else for him. No family, no land, no belonging. Now both stood at the same table of fate, two people discarded by empire in different ways, making choices not to return to what was lost, but to build something fragile in the ashes. From that night on, their exchanges were no longer only silence. A few words passed between them, simple but important. She would answer when he asked if she had eaten, and once, quietly, she asked him if his shoulder pained him, noticing how he rubbed it each night. He was startled at her attention, but he answered with honesty, "Yes, since Germania." It never healed. She nodded as if she understood. In that fragile space between past and present, trust was no longer a possibility. It had already begun. Winter passed into spring, and the town on the frontier shifted with the seasons. Soldiers came and went, merchants carried news from distant provinces, and the tavern remained the same, its walls stained with smoke, its floors worn by countless boots. Yet inside, a change had settled that most did not see. The girl no longer moved with the stiff, frightened obedience of her first days. She worked with quiet determination, her back straighter, her eyes lifting now and then to meet those around her. She was still silent most of the time, but her silence no longer came from fear. It had become choice strength, a way of keeping dignity in a world that had tried to strip it away. Marcus remained at his table, steady as always, but his presence had grown into something more than habit. The other men had begun to notice that no one disturbed her when she served his side of the room. Some whispered that she belonged to him, though no such claim had ever been made. The truth was simpler. His watchfulness alone kept her safe. The tavern owner, shrewd as ever, allowed it. As long as the soldiers kept buying drink and there was no trouble, he had no reason to interfere. The girl thought often about the question Marcus had asked her, whether she wished to leave. In the weeks since, she had replayed it in her mind. She realized that for the first time since her capture, she had been given a choice. Not freedom as Rome defined it, but a choice that belonged to her. She chose to stay, not because she was bound, but because in staying, she had found something she could hold on to. One night, when the tavern was nearly empty and the fire burned low, Marcus rose from his usual place and joined her at the hearth. She looked at him, waiting. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he removed a small piece of cloth from his belt, folded and worn. Inside was a simple carved figure, a token from years past. He placed it on the table between them. "I carried this since Dacia," he said quietly. "It was given to me by a man who didn't live to see the next day. I kept it because it reminded me I was not alone, even when I felt I was." Her hand hovered near the figure, not daring to touch it first. She looked at him with uncertainty, searching his face for intent. His eyes were steady. Slowly, she reached out and placed her fingers beside his on the table, not taking the token, but acknowledging it. Her voice was soft, unsteady but real. "Then I will stay beside you. I will not run." Marcus felt a weight lift that he had carried for years. He nodded once, not as a soldier, but as a man who finally allowed himself to accept companionship. He did not smile. Smiles were rare for him, but his eyes softened in a way she had never seen before. The unanswered questions from the beginning now found their place. What would become of her? She would remain, not as a nameless servant, but as someone who had chosen her place with her own will. What of Marcus, the scarred veteran? He had not been forgotten in silence after all. He had found in her a reason to sit each night, not in loneliness, but in quiet belonging. And what of the tavern itself, once only a place of transactions? For them, it had become a shelter, not perfect, but enough. As spring grew warmer, their bond was no longer invisible. She no longer avoided his gaze when she set down bread. Sometimes, she spoke first, and he, who had once sat apart from the world, now sat with her near the hearth. Two lives no longer live in isolation. There was no triumph to announce, no grand victory to display. Only the decision, firm and fragile, to endure together. In a world that had taken family and honor from both of them, they created something new, the simple choice to stay side by side. For the first time in years, neither of them was alone.